Good morning and welcome to Market Outsiders. It's Wednesday, June 11th. My name is Namaan. I'm joined by my colleague Jenny Rae. Jenny Rae, you are in Philadelphia this week. And so before we get into today's news, I have to ask you, how many times have people told you the Eagles won the Super Bowl? And how many cheesesteaks have you eaten?
Okay, question number two, I can answer really easily because on the first night, I gave everyone a straight up education. If you come from Philly or you're anywhere close to here, which I'm from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, y'all do not put the cheese on top of the cheesesteak. That's nonsense. Everybody who's local knows that you put the cheesesteak on the bun and then you put the cheese, a little bit of a drizzle on the top, but you got to let it soak in. Otherwise, you just have like this total mishmash of nonsense. So that's what makes a Philly cheesesteak a cheesesteak is that you put the cheese on the bottom and the steak on the top. Get it right. Okay. So I had one the first night at a conference and nobody knew this. And so I literally made like 50 friends explaining to them exactly how this needed to be done. And we were BFFs through the rest of the conference. So that was super fun. Then we went to Cleaver's for the second night. Cleaver's is kind of newer on the scene. A foot long cheesesteak, so not messing around. They said there were 8 ounces of steak on there. Like if it wasn't 16, I don't even know if I can count. It was the most enormous cheesecake ever. But also, I went to 1-900 ice cream. And I have to say, like, I have a lot of prejudices about ice cream. One of them is that I never eat vanilla ice cream, and I did not, don't worry. But I also don't like soft serve. And everybody was like walking out with these soft serves with a line around the corner. I was super confused. So I went in and I ordered a soft serve, and I'm not confused anymore. So if you're in Philly, Cleavers and the 1-900 ice cream, honestly, I don't know if that's like an ad for them. I tell you what, it should be. They were phenomenal, worth it.
Okay. What
How many
about the
times did
first
the Eagles
question?
win the Super Bowl?
How many times
I
have you
heard it
hear
zero
someone tell you
times.
that? Yeah,
Zero times.
really? Okay.
Yeah, I know. It's not that they're not proud. It's just that the Phillies are playing now. So like, move on, move on.
And they've been, well, I know Eagles fans, they don't move on, but that's a different talk show. So, well, let's get to
When
what
we
we're.
do the like economics of stadiums and sports teams like that episode, let's absolutely highlight the Eagles specifically because they're an unusual breed. Eagles fans and Jets fans, I tell you what, if you want to get into a fight, one of the easiest ways to do it is to go to those games and wear the opposing team's jersey. Like
100%. I lived in the Philly area for 3 years. So I've got firsthand experience. So,
absolutely.
well, today's big market news and economic news is that the May inflation print just dropped. And so let's walk through the data first, and then we can layer on some of our insights after that. So what I'm going to do is for those of you who are watching this on YouTube or on Spotify, we are on video, and so I'm going to share this article so you have a visual reference as well as what we're talking about. And so the headline here in the Wall Street Journal is that inflation rose to 2.4% in May, in line with expectations. And just for those of you who may not be familiar, when we talk about inflation rising to 2.4%, that's a year over year comparison. So that's inflation rising 2.4% compared to May of 2024. So that's the baseline that we're talking about here. And I'll talk about the month over month in just a minute. This is in line with expectations. The thing that
Naman,
caught
can
my
I just
attention,
talk about that real quickly? Because I know you're going to go into the details,
yeah.
but like I disagree with the premise of that because of the way that the markets are responding. Um, I think if this was in line with expectations, you would not see the rally that's happening right now in pre-market
So
trading. What do you think?
So I'm actually, and I don't know if I'm looking at outdated data or you are, but I'm not seeing a huge rally in the futures right now. Like so I'm seeing like marginal increase. And one of the things that I'm trying to suss out for myself is that because of the deal with China that was just announced, or is that because of the inflation print, or is it both? And so um, you tell me your thoughts, but to me, I think
I'll show them
the
in a bit, but yeah, I know
show them
the
in a
futures
bit.
are up, right?
Futures
Dow,
are
S
up,
and P, Nasdaq,
but
and that like if there's other reasons for that, then that's fine. But
yeah.
what I'm seeing is that it's up for that. So like I agree that this is that it did not outpace numbers, which I'll look at an article in a second that basically said the opposite of what you just said, which was that like that it like underperformed based on all of the macroeconomic signals we were expecting. But it was like, but I don't think that it, I think that it underpaced what expectations were.
Here,
So
I think Yeah,
Yeah,
for
go ahead.
me, this is like a ho-hum inflation report from the perspective of the markets. It's like, okay, great. Like this is what we expected. So things are not worse than we expected. Like maybe there was some like downside protection that the markets had priced in. And so now that things aren't as bad as we expected, great. There's a little bit of an uptick. Um, but the Fed's inflation target is 2%. So we're at 2.4%. And we can argue about the merits of a 2% inflation target. Like it's completely arbitrary. Again, that's a different talk show, right? So we can talk about if the Fed should have a different target or not. But if the target is 2% and we're at 2.4%, it's a little bit higher than we would like, but it's not crazy. And so the thing that was interesting to me was the core inflation. And so core inflation excludes food and energy because those two price categories are so seasonal and they're so volatile. And so sometimes you get muddy data when you include food and energy in the inflation print. And so they separate those out for the core inflation, and that rose 2.8%. So that the core was higher than the overall rate, which tells me that a lot of what's driving kind of the lower inflation, if you will, or the inline inflation with expectations is the fact that energy prices are so low right now. Because
Bingo. This is such a
when,
huge thing.
yeah. And so, like, a big driver, a big input cost for almost any business and almost any sector of the economy is energy, uh, including food, right? Energy is a big input cost for food. And so, I think our saving grace right now is the fact that energy prices are so low. And one of the things I'm going to be watching in future months is what do oil prices do? Because if oil prices start to tick up, then you're going to start to see the overall inflation rate tick up as well.
Absolutely. In fact, this is, I think, the bigger story than anything about tariffs that's happening in the market, anything about price increases being passed on from anyone that's in the major market. This is the issue: is that you can see nearly perpetual economic growth if you have lower energy prices. I think the Trump administration gets this. I don't think that they're actually trumpeting it enough. But the low energy prices that they have had compared to the Biden administration are not even at the targets where they want to get them to. And this absolutely gives you a ton of flexibility in other economic policy if you're able to manage energy costs down. You constrain yourself. It like the Biden administration constrained its options based on its lack of focus on energy prices. So they're pushed to green energy, which is naturally more expensive. They're pushed to not use pipelines that have already been built. Right, a lot of that kind of changed the energy equation. And so when people ask me what I thought about some of the Trump administration's picks, my number one factor when I was looking at somebody like Scott Bessent was, hey, are you going to be focused on the energy piece of this equation? And I think he got it right away. And so I just said, like, I think that everybody's over focusing on other measures and energy is so much more important. So I absolutely agree with you.
I think this is not just interesting from a macroeconomic policy perspective, but from public policy, like now is the time that you should be adding to the strategic petroleum reserve. Like if you want to think about when's a good time to stockpile, it's when energy prices are low because you either stockpile them for an emergency or you can sell them when energy prices are high for a profit. And so like one of the things that I've been following as well, just because I'm a little bit of a nerd and I like to dig into this stuff, is like, is
A
the
little
Trump
bit.
administration, yeah,
Are you,
exactly.
are you also
Like,
a
are
little bit of
they
an Eagles fan?
no, no, I'm not. So unfortunately, I'm a Bengals fan, and we'll have to go through a group therapy session later to unpack all of that. But one of the things that they're doing right now is they're actually adding to the Strategic Petroleum Reserve,
Yeah.
and so that's another thing that I would expect to see. And I think the trick is for the U.S. government is how do you add to the Strategic Petroleum Reserve without actually bringing so much demand to the table that you raise prices? And so that's, I think, the needle that they're trying to thread right now. And it seems like they're doing an okay job of that. The second thing that I just wanted to mention here, Jenny Ray, beyond the effect of energy on inflation, is just what we referenced at the beginning, which is this is a year over year number, which is not how you and I think about inflation. It's not how any consumer thinks about inflation. Like I don't even remember what I paid last May for food or energy or anything. And
What was the
so
price of eggs?
no
Who
clue,
knows?
right? But I know
Yeah.
what I paid last month. And so I think there's a disconnect between how the government really tracks data and how people use it and apply it in the real world, which is why I like to think about the month to month inflation number as well. And that rose 0.1% in May from April. So that I think gives us like a more up-to-date picture of what's happening with prices now, and they're basically flat. And so what I'm going to be interested in seeing moving forward now is okay, people's point of reference is like the last couple of months. You're really seeing inflation over the last couple of months stay flat. And so, does that affect consumer sentiment? Does it affect the way that people feel about the economy? Does it affect the way that people feel about their own purchasing power? Because one of the things that policymakers are paying attention to is people's inflation expectations. Because the fear is that those inflation expectations become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you think that everything's going to be more expensive tomorrow, you're going to buy it today. And if there's outsized demand for those goods and services today, it's going to lead to inflation. And so policymakers care a lot about managing our expectation of future inflation just because of the self-fulfilling prophecy that it can become. So the fact that inflation has been flat over the last couple of months, I'm going to be interested to see if that bleeds over into consumer sentiment and if people's inflation expectations start to decrease now as a result of that. And that would be incredibly good news for Congress and for this administration as they think about some of the economic policies that they're looking to implement.
Yeah, absolutely. Naman, I would love to share something on my screen, but before I do that, can you just scroll down? I wanted to see what was kind of underneath the fold on that piece. Yeah, because you had the chart. Yeah, can you just kind of talk a little bit about this? Um, so yeah, there it is. Future side of the S&P. Okay, there it does say it in there, right? There the futures are rising after the report came out. But like you said, right, the month of over month reading was below the 0.2%. These are not drastic changes. This is not Nvidia blowing earnings out of the water by $60 billion, right? This is a totally different number. But really it is saying that the expectations from what we see on the news is not mirrored inside the data. And I think this is really important when if y'all are running a business line right now, you can probably take price, but you can only take a little bit of price, is what this data is saying, right? Like you can't necessarily say, hey, we're in an inflationary period, costs are rising, we've got to increase everything. But you certainly also don't have to worry as much about the inflationary pressures across the broader economy in the same way that you would otherwise. So I think that the news is doing a disservice to America right now by fostering a sense of uncertainty that is not being realized in the data. We saw this with the jobs report, we see this with the inflation report. And I just think it's important that any of you that want to operate in this realm behave based on the data and not based on the sentiment that you see in the daily news. So we talk about the daily news, but it's important for you to recognize that. I just wanted to share a couple of the headlines that I'm seeing them on because I think that this will highlight some of the focus areas. So let me just pull up my screen. Right. So the New York Times said CPI inflation data is muted as tariff impact is limited. um, I was like, what a freaking misleading title that is. So basically, what they're saying is that that CPI inflation is not what they expected. The tariff impact is limited, and then we went into the detail below it. And basically, they're just still trying to tell the tariff story. Tariff impacts have not been realized in the market yet, and so it's a story that will only be realized later that they kind of can't start harping on now. This one today, right? Stock market today, Dow, S&P, and NASDAQ futures rise as cool inflation data boost. So I agree with everything that you said before. The only thing I disagreed with is that I don't think that this was what the market was expecting. I think it was expecting higher than expected inflation based on consumer uncertainty. And as we've teased it out, there are some places Nike said they're going to be raising prices, right? We did highlight some of the companies that said that they were going to exercise price increases because of the at least uncertainty impact of tariffs. What we're just seeing is that that has not made a substantial impact in the overall market.
I think we'll have to agree to disagree there. I think there's a difference between what the market expects and what the media expects. And so I think if you look at if you're thinking about what the market is expecting is shaped by the media, then yeah, this is probably below your expectations. But if you're looking at the data directly, which like the market is doing, then I think that this is in line with expectations. Otherwise, I think you'd be seeing futures rocket up this morning. But we'll see what happens now that the opening bell is rung. And as investors continue to digest this data, we'll see what ends up happening here over the next few hours.
Look, was it cheesecake? Was it 8 inches or was it 12 inches? Like a 12-inch cheesesteak is definitely better than an 8-inch cheesesteak. Rockets are better in the market than rises, but definitely, when people talk about this challenge of expectations, I just think it's valuable to look at how the markets are responding. So yeah, absolutely, I can agree with you on that. And any change from expectations was, as you can see, super small here. In fact, if you went back to the chart that you were looking at, Naman, we don't have to bring it back up, but like one of the things that I think is interesting about it that no one is talking about is how far inflation has come down from its peak. And so even though we still have an inflation number that is above the Fed target, we are significantly lower than where we were at peak inflation. And you basically, it's like Biden administration is just, that like when everybody said there's not inflation, the inflation isn't real. You can see right there in the data that was pretty significant inflation, and it was measured year over year. So you really were only seeing the effects of it even a little bit later than it was showing up. So the fact that we're here means that that this market started to cool a little bit last year, but it really only came under wraps more recently. So we should see if this trend continues, inflation expected to continue to temper out. The X factor is tariffs and also energy prices, right? So, but the two are key pieces of the same
Hmm.
coin.
And so I, you know, I think everyone can objectively agree the Fed probably started to take inflation seriously too late. But once they started to act, they've done a pretty decent job at getting inflation under control. And that's one of the reasons, if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you've been hearing me say, I think it's time for them to start shifting their focus away from inflation and towards the labor market. Because the Fed has a dual mandate. It's to keep inflation at around 2% annually, and it's to ensure full employment in the US. And so I think what this tells me is that more and more the labor market is where the Fed should shift its focus. And so I think you're going to start to see policy discussions, you're going to start to see policy decisions that cater more to the strength of the labor market now, as opposed to inflation moving forward. And so I'm hopeful that that's going to be the tack that the Fed takes. And it'll be interesting to see here over the course of these policy meetings they have over the summer, if they agree with that take and if they start to move in that direction.
Well, I've got time for one more cheesesteak in Philly today. So if anybody has a recommendation of a place that I haven't been yet, pop it in the chat or send us an email. We're always open to it. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be with you tomorrow, and have a great day today. Thanks, everybody.